Yeah, what do we have for good news for the protests going on, except for the fact that everyone is still awake. Everyone is still 100% aware that George Floyd was murder,
Right.
And I think it's just the level of awareness of the militarization of the police and everything is still very heightened.
I don't think the protests are going to die down, especially because I think things are going to get worse economically, unfortunately, over the next
Right.
few months. So you're going to see probably a continuation of unrest. What I'm noticing, though, is kind of the reaction is getting organized now. So you have, of course, you have Trump calling for sending the military into cities to put down. Um, to dominate these protests or whatever. But you also have people.
But he hasn't, and I wonder if
He
that's like a
hasn't.
political move to make people on his side say,
Right.
"See, this is what the Democrats do."
Right. Well, I mean, what I'm finding also interesting is that people in the so-called left, kind of center left, are saying they're starting to second guess now the motive for the protests and saying, well, when it goes down to tearing down, when it comes to tearing down statues of Ulysses Grant or whatever, or this is going too far, or we're seeing, it just seems like they're looking for reasons now to say, okay, it's going too far. It's a threat. It's a potential threat to the republic. It could evolve into anarchy. You had this reaction from the right, from Trump, authoritarian response to the protests. But I'm also seeing recently reaction kind of in the I call it the center left, I guess. I've seen Kim Iverson talking about, are they going after baby Jesus now? They're basically, it's against, it's not just against the Confederate War monuments, but anybody who represents it's against America essentially. And also this guy, Brett Weinstein, who's one of the founders of the intellectual dark web, the IDW. He was recently on Joe Rogan, and I heard part of that, and he's very concerned about the anarchy that can result from these protests because they don't have a clear idea of what they're fighting for, and that this is a threat to the republic. So again, it's an attack on America, either consciously or whatever. But I think it's interesting how we're getting that reaction from the the so-called left, and I think there's a lot more legitimacy to these protests than they're actually giving them credit for. And I think there's a valid criticism from the I guess I call it the establishment, for lack of a better term, that the protests, in some respect, they don't have a clear-cut program. They don't have clear-cut goals. And this was also a criticism of Occupy Wall Street, that they were against Wall Street. They were against the corruption. They were somehow against crony capitalism, but it never really translated into a clear-cut policy, and it kind of just fizzled out. And you kind of had the Tea Party, and you had these different things that they were maybe related to it, but it didn't result in a direct legislative program. And I think maybe it is time to start talking about what would be a program for the protests, other than just police reform or defund the police. I mean, is there some kind of could somehow the progressive program of single payer health care, of end the wars, and somehow all these things somehow be tied into the protests and say, this is what we're calling for? What do you think?
Well, that would take some kind of centralized control over, or at least some, either existing or someone. It could be a Bowman, or it could be a Bowman. Actually, you've seen him speak. He's really
right.
Somebody that's able to grab the reins, right, and steer it in a more productive direction, right. Or right now, unfortunately, videotape of shootings in Chop, Seattle are not going to do us any good, right? And videotapes of people with automatic weapons guarding the borders of Chop are not going to do us any good. And we do need somebody to take the reins of the really valid anger and outrage that people have.
Right.
and try and steer it in a productive direction.
The first thing that I wanted to talk about was the statues coming down, right? So I can hear both sides of the argument. I do understand that obviously for some people it is offensive to see the glorification of certain figures in history because of, you know, their past, right? Because just like what Kim Iverson was saying, that we're all human and that we all have transgressions that we have committed, and so really we wouldn't be able to glorify anybody essentially, right? Like that's you know, one part of it. And the other part of it is that when you start there, where do you stop? You know, that, and it seems like that's always the issue, right? In any
Right.
sort of like what is considered social justice, sort of movement, you always have this whole sense of, okay, so but where do we end this? You know what I'm saying? Like, you obviously you need to have clear defined goals, and once you achieve them, but being a progressive, quote unquote, you're never actually at your goal. The goalpost is always changing, right? And so I can see how for some people it is erasing their history, and like I said, it's this whole thing of where do you end. But you know, when I heard it being compared to, well, what about if that was like a statue of Hitler? You know, would we want to have statues? I mean, obviously we're not in Germany, but you know, if we were, you know, would that be okay? And obviously, how do you say yes, it'd be okay to have
Right.
statues
Yeah.
of Hitler?
What are the boundaries? Right.
Right. Exactly.
At the same time, you want to remember the horrors of history, right? So you want to have that.
Which Kim did talk about in her thing.
Like you have Auschwitz is a museum or whatever, right?
Exactly.
And you want that. You want people to have it. No, this really happened. This is real. This is real. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And think about it, even with all the memorials and stuff that we have today for the Holocaust, there are still people out there, there are factions of people out there that they are Holocaust deniers, that they say that the Holocaust did not even happen, you know? So, and I think it also has to do with that, you know, we do have this connection with our historical figures, but if you ask young people from today and like about these figures, a lot of the times they don't really even know anything about these figures. They don't know why we fought the Civil War. A lot of these things have been, you know, they've gone down the toilet. So the whole taking down the statue thing, which gets to my other point, is what is it really serving, right? So you have a lot of these people, again, with this mob mentality of, okay, let's just burn it all down, fuck it, you know, let's get rid of everything, you know. But they're not doing it for the purpose of that this is supposed to be some sort of retribution for these oppressed people. It's just like a symbolic gesture. And for what? And so our movements are being co-opted. Like what you were saying, Steve, that, okay, so we need to, you know, have some sort of economic justice sort of, like theme or, you know, demand to these movements. But, you know, in all fairness, it's not your say to say what these movements are about. Supposedly these protests were about the injustice of police brutality, specifically against people of color. That was the whole message. That was the whole point of these protests, and that's all been lost now because of all of this co-option that's been going on from freaking Nancy Pelosi with her freaking kente cloth scarf, you know,
right?
Like, and those
right.
like the celebrities coming out with their black and white video, and you know, it's like it's all about putting a little black square. It's all a co-option of this movement, and so the message is totally lost, and that in itself takes away the validation of the movement. And now it's just this whole thing of, oh, well, you're just trying to erase my history, and you don't care about my history, about my pain. That's it. That's all it becomes now. You know?
All right. Well, what about, if we just stick to police reform? I mean, obviously there's a Democratic bill, and maybe, I don't know if you're going to discuss that later in the show, Daisy, but you know, does that really I mean, they're talking about like body cams and things like that, but it seems like it's, um, it's nibbling around the edges. It's not really
And
dealing with systemic um, issues as far as they exist.